Thank you very much. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
It's great to be back in Milwaukee. I guess this is my third or fourth time at least, not including the recent visit on Skype with Shelley's class. That was a lot of fun. Thank you for that nice introduction. Thanks for the invitation, Doug, and the nice invitation, Bryce, introduction. I guess some consolation to Buck fans, and we almost had some commiseration with Cavs fans, but we sort of pulled it out the other day. Thanks for the mention of the NCNE. We're working on that as an organization. It's really a network of scholars all around the country that work on research on how nonprofit organizations use economic resources to the benefit of fostering the missions of nonprofit organizations and use those resources effectively to promote nonprofit social missions. Doug is a member of that network, and we're trying to find ways to engage the research on nonprofits to the benefit of the nonprofit practice. So I view my engagement in events like this as part of the activity of the NCNE, and we're looking for ways to do more activities of this sort. So that's why I've got the NCNE logo on some of my slides, and in this trip and others, we'll be having conversations about how we can do more of this thing. So today, I would like to talk about some of this kind of approach, and this is one of the books that Bryce has mentioned that has come out of this kind of effort. I hope we don't have to be too formal about this. We can have a conversation, so don't feel too reluctant to interrupt me. I'm a professor, and I can, talk and ramble and get boring, but we don't have this, too huge a group, and we can have some interaction. There are times when we can have a dialogue, and there's a point where I'm going to ask you to sit down and think and go through a little bit of an exercise. I want to first have some discussion about what the landscape looks like for the financing of nonprofit organizations. And it really is more or less an appreciation for how diverse and complex it is. And then go into the theme of the book, the theme of our discussion of benefits theory, which is how to understand and appreciate that landscape. And to delve into that in some detail further by looking at particular stories and case studies of particular organizations. And then to have you think about that further through your own exercise by thinking about your own organizations and what it looks like for you, and then have some queries back and forth in terms of questions and answers. So I guess I've maybe given the answers to this question away, but if you had to come up with one word or so to characterize what stands out about nonprofit finance, what's the one word that you would come up with to describe nonprofit finance, what would it be? Here's your chance to participate already.
Volatile.
Volatile, that's a good one. See, there are a lot of words actually, yes.
I go with diverse.
It's what?
Diverse.
Diverse, that's a good one.
Complex.
Complex. Okay, we're pretty much in the same ball.
Challenging.
Challenging.
Underfunded.
What?
Underfunded.
Underfunded. These are all correct. There's no wrong. There are no wrong answers.
Time consuming.
What's that?
Time consuming.
Time consuming, absolutely.
Misunderstood.
Misunderstood. That's why we're here. Yeah, and these are all correct. But the one that I want to emphasize, which is pretty close to a lot of what you said, is variation. There's no one way of saying this is how you finance a nonprofit organization. I couldn't tell you a formula saying, okay, you just do this, you just go out and sell things, or you just raise money a particular way, okay? There is no standard formula. And people used to talk about that, or they used to say, okay, there's some panacea, you go out and you create an endowment, and that's the way you do it, or you have a fundraising event, and that's the way you do it. Every year you have a fundraising event, or there's nothing like that, or you raise a third from selling in your gift shop, and you raise a third from having an annual event, and you raise a third from direct mail, and that's it. There's nothing like that. It's more nuanced than that, and furthermore, there's nothing that, sure, experience counts, but you go from one organization to another. You can't take, your formula from one organization and go to the other organization and say, I did this here, it automatically transfers there. So it'd be nice if that were true, but on the other hand, it makes life more interesting, gives employment to people that want to be able to create work from one organization to another rather than simply hand a piece of paper from one person to another that thinks that they can tell one organization what to do. So what about that variation? Well, we know that if we look at the aggregate, for example, what does the financing in the sector look like? One characteristic of this variation is that there are lots of different sources of financing for nonprofits. So this is just for the registered charities. So these are the organizations that actually file 990 charitable tax forms, right? So it's already a restricted part of the sector that is large enough to have to file a 990 form. Used to be $25,000 or more. Now it's $50,000 or more. This was 2013. If we add all those numbers up, we can see that there are several major different sources of funds that they depend upon, and they're very different sources. There's fees for service, there's fees from government contracts and so forth, there's donations, which include both individual donations and grants from foundations and such. There's government grants, there's returns from investments, there's other different sources of funds. And that's just an aggregate picture. That doesn't mean that every organization has this particular distribution. It just means when you put all the money together, that's what it looks like. And within this whole pot, organizations have many different combinations of this sort of mix. So if we cut down into different fields of service, or we look even within different fields of service, and the IRS cuts things into 26 different major fields of service, and then within that, many different fields of service within that. You get lots of variation within those fields. And then, of course, we can look at other variables by size of organization. We get more and more and more and more variation. So there's lots and lots of variation in terms of what these, what we call income portfolios look like in terms of different types of organizations. So we can cut it a variety of ways. One very swift cut of the knife would be there's a real big difference between organizations as a whole in this charitable sector and what happens when you take out what people call eds and meds. Okay? Take out the universities and take out the hospitals, because those hospitals and universities are big and they're very highly dependent on fees. The hospitals are very highly dependent on the service charges for their services, and the universities are very highly dependent on tuitions. Okay? Take those out, and you find that without those, you find that you now depend much more highly on fees from government sources, and you're much more highly dependent on contributions, and you're much less dependent on fees from private sources. So the whole sector, with them in there, is much more highly dependent on private fees, but without them, much less dependent on private fees, and much more dependent on contributions. So we can see that this sector looks very different without eds and meds. If we break it down much more finely by fields of service, and it's not that fine, if these are just looking at, here's like 6 major sectors, and this is still pretty gross, we can see, you know, lots of variation here. Human services, for example, which maybe many of you work in, is pretty evenly spread in terms of these different sources of funds, right? I mean, private contributions are sort of on par with fees for service, which are on par with fees from government, which are pretty much in the same level as government grants. Environment is very highly dependent on private contributions, and so forth. Arts and culture, very highly dependent on private contributions, and secondarily fairly dependent on fees from private sources, which is kind of box office. So, you know, point made, there's no one pattern here in terms of what the financial portfolios of nonprofits look like. And it looks very much like what you do has a lot to say about where your money comes from. Okay, so that's a big part of the message, which kind of underlies this notion of the benefits theory of nonprofit finance. This is another chart that basically looks at the size issue, which suggests that smaller nonprofits tend to finance themselves differently than larger nonprofits. But here again, things are mixed in because eds and meds, for example, tend to be larger, right? Universities and hospitals are big, and they're mixed in with the larger ones, and they are much more heavily fee-for-service dependent, whereas the smaller ones are much more leaning on private contributions. And of course, you know, behind this is also lurks the fact that we don't keep track of these resources very well either, because one of the, ask yourself this question, what's one big thing that's missing from all of these numbers? When you think about the important resources that go into supporting these institutions, particularly the smaller ones.
Volunteers.
Volunteers, right? So especially for the smaller ones, we're not counting the value of the volunteer hours. And, you know, when people figure out the worth of those hours, those calculations often show that the worth of those hours is at least equal in the aggregate to the worth of the monetary dollars that comes into the sector. I mean, it practically doubles the amount of voluntary contributions that comes into the sector in terms of equivalent dollars. Unfortunately, I mean, there are ways of doing it, but nonprofits tend not to do it, and we don't have accounts that show that very well. We ought to do it. There's methodology that shows us how to do it, but it usually doesn't show up on accounts, and it would be very good to do it because we don't really make very good decisions about our resources because we don't have those numbers in front of us to understand how important it is to be able to take account of the actual resources that we have available. So, in any case, I think in a case like this, we'd see the private contributions for the smaller organizations to be even more important because of the volunteer contribution, not just the monetary contributions there. Yeah.
Another thing statistically you're missing here is variation between organizations even within the categories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because there are some organizations
Sure.
that are 100% fee for service. You think about organizations that deal in human tissue like blood and organs,
Yeah.
or the servicers for mortgages or student loans. And
Right.
then you have organizations that are 100% dependent on private contributions, like almost every church in this country.
Mm-hmm.
You know, without that, they wouldn't exist. So I mean, there's
Right.
massive amount of variation even within these categories.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And, one of the things that we're trying to do, I think, within this whole idea of benefits theory is to say it really applies at the individual organizational level. And when you're trying to figure out how best to finance your organization, you need to start with your mission, and you need to spin that outwards to figure out what your portfolio should be.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's useful to look at this big picture to get a sense of why it's necessary to think this way. But it doesn't make a case that all organizations in a given category should be financed in a particular way. Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, so it does help us to understand this variation. We need a theory to help us understand this variation. And I'm not going to talk about that today. There is one of the things that this theory has helped to do is to contribute to the research literature to help us understand why there is this variation there. Okay, so that has, and there is some